Welcome back to View from DC. I've just been talking with Jeffrey Lacker, President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. We've seen some weaker data on the US economy recently, and President Lacker gave me his views on what that means for monetary policy. He's also been thinking about how the financial regulation bill, which still hasn't been passed by Congress, should be turned into practical regulations. President Lacker, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
So we've seen some weaker data from the economy in the last couple of months, and we're starting to hear this dreaded word double dip here and there. What's your view? Are you concerned, and what's your outlook for the economy?
I think a double dip is quite unlikely. It's important to keep in mind earlier in the year we were getting data that was better than expected for a little streak of time, and this is a recovery that's going to be choppy, uneven, little surges, little pauses, and nothing I've seen so far suggests that we're not seeing that play out. I'm expecting growth to continue. It's important to remember as well the economy still is expanding despite the slightly disappointing data we've seen in the last few weeks.
Do you think the balance of risks to the economy has changed at all? I mean, do you now think there's an increased risk that we might see weaker growth?
If anything, I do think there's maybe a notch higher risk of growth being for a couple of quarters below trend. But I don't think that's the most likely outcome. I still think we're headed back to growth in the 3% range.
And what about inflation? What's the balance look like between the risk that inflation maybe starts to increase or that it continues to be very weak or even falls towards?
I think we're in a reasonably good place on inflation. Core numbers have come in a bit firmer in the last couple of months, which suggests that we're going to be gravitating back to 1.5–2% range over the remainder of the year, barring some unforeseen shocks. And that's consistent with the stability of inflation expectations that we've seen throughout this period earlier this year when inflation numbers were on the low side.
And what does all that imply for monetary policy?
Well, I'm comfortable with rates very low where they are right now. Just how long they stay there is a matter of conjecture. It's going to depend on how the data comes in. I'm going to be looking for a time when growth is strong enough and well enough established that it'll be clear that higher rates are warranted.
But the next move by the Fed will be a tightening rather than...
Yes, I think it's a safe bet.
And where do you stand on the issue, when the time eventually comes, of how the Federal Reserve should go about its tightening? So do you think the first thing is a rise in interest rates, or the first thing is maybe starting to reduce the size of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet and the assets that it built up during the crisis?
That's a good question, and one about which there's been a lot of active discussion. I think there are some advantages to reducing bank reserves, draining bank reserves, reducing our balance sheet before we raise interest rates. And the reason has to do with just the confidence we can have about the effect of a change in interest rates on broader market interest rates and on the economy as a whole. I think we have a better idea of how that's going to work when reserve balances are low than if they remained high.
Let's turn now to financial regulation, which is an area where you've been quite vocal. What do you think of the financial regulation bill, which has almost passed its way through Congress?
It has its good points and it has its aspects that are going to be a challenge for us going forward to make them work. On the good side, I think restricting our lending powers, transferring them to the Treasury explicitly, emergency lending powers, is a good thing. I think the tighter capital restrictions will be a good thing. I think that reducing some of the impediments that were in the Gramm-Leach-Bliley legislation on our ability to look at non-bank entities is a good thing. And more broadly, just the fact that it gets out of the way the uncertainty about what this whole thing was going to look like. On the challenging side, I'd point to resolution authority. I think it's going to be important for regulators to provide some clarity about how they tend to implement those powers, because the bill gives them a tremendous amount of discretion. And I think establishing this new consumer financial protection entity and working out how they relate to and interact with safety and soundness supervisors and agencies is going to be crucial as well, because there's the inevitable potential for tension between those two functions.
So let's talk about the resolution authority. The wording of the bill is now going to have to be turned into practical regulations by organisations such as the Federal Reserve. What do you think are going to be the big issues in doing that? And what would you like to see, for shape of the regulations be?
I think the crucial thing for regulators to pay attention to when they're writing the implementing regulations for the Resolution Authority is the clarity of expectations that market participants can have about how short-term creditors are going to be treated if one of these institutions is subject to this Resolution Authority and liquidation. Because ambiguity about that was just deadly over the last few years coming into this crisis. So being clear on when support will be forthcoming and being clear on when it won't be forthcoming, and hopefully that the latter is going to be the broader set of circumstances.
Do you think it's actually possible to do that, though? I mean, can regulators credibly say before a crisis, no, we're not going to bail you out? That's certainly not what we saw during the last couple of years.
Well, I think regulators can say that, but you're right that the crucial question has to do whether they can say that credibly. My sense is that it would likely take some demonstration effect to complete the establishment of credibility of a commitment, a policy commitment like that. That is to say, regulators would have to demonstrate, if they said they're not going to intervene in a certain situation, that they're actually willing to not intervene in a certain situation like that. They have to let a big institution fail in a way that short-term creditors aren't supported or buffered against losses.
That sounds like it could be quite painful in a crisis. And do you think that regulators will really be able to push that through? And what would you like to see politicians do to help give that credibility to regulators for the future?
Well, I think politicians or political leaders have already done a lot by decrying rescues of large financial institutions. And I think they've very clearly articulated what seems to me to be the will of the country, that using taxpayer resources to soften the blow to the creditors of a large institution is just not popular and won't be tolerated. So I would think that that would provide the kind of backbone that regulators need to be able to stand up to a tough situation and let something be handled through liquidation rather than with a bailout.
And let's talk about the Consumer Protection Agency now, which you mentioned. What would you like to see happen there?
Well, we've already gone a long way in the last couple of years towards crafting consumer regulations that do more to protect consumers against unexpected or unanticipated increases in their costs ex post after something happens to their situation, either through a deterioration in their credit rating or and repricing, as with credit cards, or through overdrafts and the like. So we've already gone a long way. It's not clear to me how much farther we ought to go. What I'd like to see is that this consumer regulator takes into account that greater protection for some consumers is going to mean greater costs and less access to credit for other consumers, and and try and focus on getting that balance right. I think the other thing is just to be mindful of the extent to which things that affect consumer credit are often means of managing risk for a lender, and getting the balance right between safety and soundness considerations and the ability of a lender to manage a portfolio of consumer credit extension and the protection of consumer interests, as it seems.
Could you give an example of where you think that balance could go wrong?
There's myriad examples in credit card world, mortgage world, and the like. So here's an example: prepayment. So it's a popular notion is to ban prepayment penalties, and for any given mortgage, that's a kind of a thing that seems like it would make consumers better off. But in the end, without prepayment penalties, there's going to be higher costs to the lenders, and they're going to have to pass that on to consumers. So it just means a shift in the end in costs between those who know they're going to prepay or those who know they won't prepay.
What are you seeing on the ground in your district, the 5th district of the Federal Reserve System?
Well, our district stretches from Maryland to South Carolina and out into West Virginia, and experience has been varied across that region. Washington, D.C. area and suburban Maryland, Northern Virginia has held up relatively well through this recession, essentially due to the presence of large federal government spending up here, and in addition, technology, defense companies and the like. West Virginia is suffering now because of the run-up and then fall in energy prices and a tremendous amount of uncertainty about the status of energy regulation and environmental regulation that affects the energy business. Down in the Carolinas, heavily manufacturing down there, hit hard by the fall in exports a year and a half ago. The recovery is uneven, however, and they have a ways to go, and unemployment is higher down there. So that's it in a nutshell.
Jeffrey Lacker, President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. My pleasure.